Hey, today I wanted to take you guys along and show you the basics of making einkorn sourdough bread. Einkorn is an ancient grain that has so much great nutritional content. It can be anti-inflammatory. There are so many great things about it, but it's kind of in its own league when it comes to baking, because baking with einkorn flour is a lot different than baking with modern wheat flour. So today I want to take you along as I make some einkorn sourdough bread and show you some tips, and whether you're a beginner or you're just wondering how in the world do I do this, I want to give you some tips and some ways that you can just be confident in your bread making skills with einkorn flour. The easiest way to start with einkorn flour is with the all-purpose flour. Yes, whole wheat, though it is more nutritious, is actually a little bit harder to work, so we're going to start with all-purpose einkorn flour. One of the first things that you need to have ready to go is your sourdough starter. Now, I use an einkorn sourdough starter. You can use any type of sourdough starter as long as it is mature and ready to be used. So this means that you have fed it usually about 4 to 8 hours beforehand. I like shooting more for about 4. I have a mature sourdough starter, and so it is ready to go after 4 hours. It is nice and bubbly and it's ready to be baked. If your sourdough starter is not as mature, I would maybe give it a little bit longer and just make sure that you're keeping watch to make sure that it is bubbly and showing activity. Now, the reason that I use whole grain einkorn in my sourdough starter is that the whole grains actually have more of those organisms that are feeding your starter. So the germ on the outside of the einkorn is what carries the organisms that is going to feed your starter. And of course, once you have all-purpose flour, you've taken off all of the germ. So that's why I feed my starter whole wheat einkorn flour instead of the all-purpose einkorn flour. I don't do this all the time, but for most of the time I will do this just because I know that it works really well and gets my starter active quickly. So you're going to put 1 cup of einkorn sourdough starter, or whatever sourdough starter you're using, into your large bowl. Then you'll add a cup of warm water, about 100 degrees. I then add 1.5 teaspoons of salt, and I like to put in a little bit of honey as well, just to give it a little bit of sweetness. And then you'll add your flour. I am using 4 to 4.5 cups of all-purpose einkorn flour. The reason that I have a range in the amount of flour is because your sourdough starter might be a different thickness than mine. In the same way, my sourdough starter might be a different thickness than it was last week. I don't always measure things out perfectly. I don't weigh my flour when I add it to my starter. And so the thickness does vary a little bit. And I want to let you know, I don't weigh the flour when I add it in to bake either. I want to talk a little bit about going off of the feel of the dough instead of just the measurements, because this is really important when you're working with sourdough, when you're working with breads. We'll start with our 4 cups of einkorn flour, and we'll mix that all together. Your dough should start to become sticky, but you don't want it to be too thick. Mixing them all together until they come into a ball. You don't want to do it too much. You just want to make sure all of the ingredients are mixed together. If your dough is super sticky, you can add a tiny bit more of flour, have your 1/2 cup measure nearby. But we're going to wait until we start folding our dough, which you might be used to it being called kneading, but we're going to actually fold the dough. We're going to wait until that part before we add in too much extra flour. So at this point, you've brought all your ingredients together. We're going to cover up our dough and we're just going to let it sit for about 15 minutes. The reason that we do this is because einkorn does take time to absorb all of the moisture. And you might not be used to this with normal flours having to wait. We want to make sure that we know how much moisture content is actually in our dough. And so we're going to wait a little bit and let all of the grains absorb the moisture. We'll come back in about 15 minutes. Okay, once you let it sit for a little bit, you're going to come back and take out your dough. You'll put your dough onto a lightly floured surface. You can use cutting board or your counter. And then you're going to start folding the dough. Now, if your dough is a little bit too sticky, and this means that it is really sticking to your hands, you're going to start adding in more flour, little bit at a time. It's okay if your dough is a tiny bit sticky. You just don't want it to be sticking all over the place, and especially don't want it to be sticking to your surface that you're trying to fold it on. We do, though, want to make sure that there is enough moisture in the dough so that as it's baking, it will be able to absorb that moisture. One of the worries when making bread is that your dough is going to be either too moist, and so it's not going to get a rise, or it's going to have too much flour in it and it'll be way too dry. Well, I want to tell you, even if it's a little bit too moist, you're probably going to end up with a pretty good loaf still. If it's too dry, you can add a little bit of water while you're folding it, and it'll probably still turn out okay. If when you're folding your dough is not sticking back to itself, then you know that your dough is a little bit too dry and it probably needs a little bit more moisture inside of it. You want it to be able to combine with itself while you're folding it. To fold your dough, you're going to just do that. It'll be like folding a paper airplane. You're going to fold it on top of itself, and then you're going to turn it 90 degrees and you'll fold it on top of itself again. You can also do this while folding it into thirds. Either way, the idea of this is that you're drawing in air, so you're making air pockets inside of the dough. And this will help your dough to rise a little bit more. Because einkorn is a heavy flour, it has a lot of protein content in it, and the gluten content is not going to be as high, so this flour will not rise like a modern wheat that you're used to. So we like to help it by putting in a little bit of extra air pockets, and that will help the rise. I like to fold the dough about 8 to 10 times, do it a couple minutes, and then I'm going to start turning the dough with my palms, kind of like I'm in pottery class, and you'll make the dough into a nice round sphere. Make sure that the bottom has been in the flour, so you've got some good flour on the bottom of that ball. And then you can even sprinkle some flour into the bottom of your large bowl as well. And you'll put that ball of dough back in your bowl. And then I like to put a wet towel over the top. You can also use plastic wrap to cover it. You'll put that bowl with your dough inside of it into a warm area, and you're going to let it rise there for about 6 to 8 hours. Now, if you let this go a little bit longer than 8 hours, it will probably be okay. I have done this and let things go overnight, and they've been okay. I just wouldn't go more than like 10 hours. When that time is up, you'll come back to that bowl, take off your covering, and you'll notice that your ball of dough has probably risen about 25% or so. You might notice that einkorn does not rise as much as modern wheat. It's, like I said, it's a heavier, it's denser. You're not going to have quite the same rise that maybe you've come to know if you've baked with other flours. And I will take my Dutch oven and I'll put a piece of parchment paper inside of it, and I'm going to put it into the oven and preheat that Dutch oven for about a half an hour. You might have to move your oven racks down in order to fit your Dutch oven into the oven. I have to do that with mine. And after you have preheated your oven and your Dutch oven is nice and toasty warm, you can take it out and you're going to gently drop your dough, your ball of dough, into your Dutch oven. And now you're going to take some of your all-purpose einkorn flour. You can spread it over the top and rub it down really gently. And now we're going to score the dough. What you're doing when you're scoring dough is you're taking a blade or a small knife and you're going to be cutting into the dough. You've probably seen some really cool designs where people make pictures or just elaborate designs on the top of their dough, and I'm not going to do anything elaborate with my dough, but I will do a few cuts here and there. And what this does is it allows for a place as your dough rises in the oven for your bread to split, because it will naturally split as it rises. And we want to give it some direction so we're telling it in a way where we want it to split. Once I have scored my dough, I'm going to put the top back on my Dutch oven and we'll put it into the oven for 20 minutes. At the end of the 20 minutes, we're going to take the lid off of the Dutch oven and we'll continue baking for another 15 minutes or so. Congratulations, the bread is done. We've made it. We can take our bread out after that 15 minutes is up, and here's the hard part. We're gonna wait. We're gonna wait for another half an hour at least, if not an hour, in order to cut into this bread, because if we cut into it too soon, the moisture inside the bread will start to crush it together. We want it to cool off so that it will hold its shape and you'll get the best texture and flavor out of it. I have to admit, I have not done this before and I have cut into it too soon. And yes, the bread is still good. Don't worry, it's still good. But it's so much better when the bread will hold its shape because you've let it cool off some. You can always reheat your bread back in the oven. Just set it at about 350 degrees and heat it up in that Dutch oven for 10 minutes or so. If you'd like to learn more about making your own Einkorn Sourdough Starter, which is truly really simple, you can click on the link to that video here. And if you'd like to see how I make a whole grain Einkorn sourdough boule or bread, then you can click on this video and I'll show you how I walk through making this bread as well. This artesian style loaf is great to go with soup. It's great on its own with a big slab of butter. I hope you guys enjoy this, and I hope this has helped give you some confidence in making your own Einkorn sourdough bread. Let me know any questions in the comment box below, and I'd love if you'd subscribe to this channel. Thank you for watching, and I will talk to you again soon. Bye-bye. See what else. Making bread is that your dough is going to be either, I want to just take it down to the basics. Oh my goodness, Sam. Lock. No, that's not it. Sam, no.